What's up? It's Andy Grammer with Jag.
Hi, this is Carly Rae Jepsen, and you're listening to Jag.
Hey everybody, it's Joe Jonas hanging with Jag.
This is Heather Knox with the hottest Jag I've ever seen.
Ryan Seacrest with Jag.
It's B.O.B. checking in with my homie Jag. So much swag with my homie Jag.
It's the Jag Show Podcast.
Welcome into this episode of the Jag Show Podcast. Today it is also on video, and more on that in a moment. I want to tell you about my week last week where I took kind of a staycation. That wasn't actually the plan. Plan was to go away somewhere, wife and dog and me, but thanks to our friend Rona, not a lot of places to go safely. So she also had some work to take care of and some work commitments, so we decided to make it a staycation, or at least I did. And yes, I did a lot of that house stuff, went to Costco and Home Depot and all that kind of errandry, but I also decided to make it a professional development week. There were a bunch of seminars and webinars that I've been meaning to get to that I hadn't been able to, so I took last week to do that. First thing I started with was the PodFest Global Summit from earlier this month. Thanks to Chris Krimitsos and the team. They did a great job. He was a former guest on a previous episode, if you want to check that out. Because I wasn't able to watch the seminars as they happen live, I bought the ticket that gives you all the recordings. So I was able to go back last week and binge all the recordings, or at least as many as I could, and really great information about the podcast business. Podcast editing had its own track, and some really great info I picked up there. And then from there, I checked out the Podcast Editor Academy, which is an offshoot of Steve Stewart's Podcast Editors Club on Facebook. Ton of archived information about software, editing, plugins, building your podcast editing business, and more. The reason I mention all of this is when you're a solopreneur or whether you're in any kind of business, it's important to take time to develop your own skills. And you may not be able to take off a week to do that, but maybe an hour a day or an hour or two a week, just spending some time staying on top of what's going on in your field, it will be so useful. And I know as I get back to recording and editing clients this week, there are a number of tools that I can't wait to try out. Also, a shout out to Carrie Caulfield-Eric and her YaYaPodcasting.com. I took her course on Isotope RX7, which is just an incredible piece of software. And also to Chris Curran, whose article, 10 Plugins for Podcasters, I've linked to in the show notes. On to other podcasting news from the last week or two. A couple quick highlights for you. And again, everything I mentioned here will be linked in the show notes. Podcast host Buzzsprout, a great article on how to use music in podcasts. Spoiler alert, you still can't use copyrighted music, even for a few seconds, even for reviewing and looking at music, but the whole article explains that. Spotify, as they take a bigger bite of the apple, so to speak, they are charging into the podcasting world and causing a shift from downloads to streaming. And the good news for that is that now advertising reach is going to be easier to measure. It's a lot easier to do it with streaming than it is with downloads. Once it's downloaded, you can't really track it. If it's streaming, you can track it in real time. Good article from Medium about having a CTA in your podcast. That is also known as a call to action. If you're ending your podcast with 30 million things for a listener to do, subscribe to our podcast and go follow us on social media and send us an email and leave a review on Apple and all those things. It's all going to be noise. Focus on one, maybe two things your listener can do and focus on why it's a benefit for them. People want to know what's in it for me. And a point that I always make that I'll add to this is save your calls to action at the end of the show. It's a business transaction. Don't ask a listener to do something until you've provided them something of value, valuable content, valuable information. If you're asking them to subscribe to your channel and follow you and all this stuff before the show and before they know why it's worth doing, they're not going to bother. Back to Spotify for a second. As you may know, they bought the free podcasting host Anchor, which I have major issues and concerns about. Anchor was caught stealing or reappropriating, or whatever you want to put it politically correctly, content from other podcast hosts and posting it on Anchor. There's some real intellectual property issues there. Once word got out this was happening, Spotify put out a statement and said they will take down all those podcasts. But this interesting article from Digiday says that it could turn into a game of digital whack-a-mole. So that's an interesting read as well. And finally, you may ask, why am I also doing this podcast on video, which you'll find on YouTube and Facebook? Well, I just listened to my friend Matt Kundle's Sound Off podcast, and he interviewed Tom Webster from Edison Research. This guy is like the research guru for all things podcasting. He is a rock star at any podcast convention that he goes to. Well, he has many great things to say about podcasting. There's a lot to take away from the interview, also linked in the show notes. One of my key takeaways was that audio consumption, 10% of it is on YouTube. People may not even be watching a YouTube video, but they may be listening to something in the background off of a YouTube page, because YouTube is great at discoverability. So as an experiment, I'm going to put this episode of the podcast on YouTube. I may continue to do it. I may not continue to do it. Not entirely sure. But that's what I'm doing with today's episode and see what happens. And that's the beauty of podcasting. Once you launch your show, it doesn't have to be a set number of this, and this. You can change things around. You can tweak things. You can ask your listeners for feedback. You can see what works. And nobody's going to get mad if you change the format of the podcast to find the best fit for you and for your listeners.
Thanks for listening to the Jag Show podcast. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe in Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. For help with your podcast, find Jag on social media at JAGinDetroit or on the web at JAGinDetroit.com.